Uh, Trust was based on real life events, is that right?
A lot of trust was based on real life events. Obviously, the story itself is fiction. I decided to do a sort of what if story and to say what if one of these accounts that did exist were still alive today and still growing, and what could happen to that money that's sitting in a Swiss bank with no one looking after it. And I thought that was an interesting concept, that it was all real. It's all and when there was the big scandal of the Swiss banks having Jewish accounts and not telling the families about them, this idea of trustee accounts came up, but nobody ever really followed through with it, because everybody said, look, the banks didn't know, because the whole idea was never to tell the bank that the person who had the account, that they were not the real owner. Because obviously you didn't want the banks telling Hitler when he arrived in Zurich or Basel or Geneva. So there was a lot of secrecy, and the idea of when all this secrecy is involved, you really have no idea of where it's going to end up, which is what happened to a lot of the families. A lot of the families don't even know where their assets ended up.
Yeah, the history that is inside the trust, we can find it in every place in the world. It's not just in one special place. And for example, you were talking about Hezbollah.
Right.
How do they get to know where is this money? How do they get to bring this money in that legal form to the other place, to their country? How it happens?
It's as you just said, that all that information is there, but it's not really there. There's a lot of subterfuge and a lot of secrecy involved in ways of getting money from one part of the world to the other. And it's not just the Hezbollah that's doing it. Basically, any terrorist group or any illegal activity. That's one of the things. Another thing, a lot of groups like the Hezbollah use the channels that money launderers use to help people just avoid paying taxes. So there's a vast sea of money out there in the world economy, and a lot of it is gray, which means not black, not white. It's sort of doubtful what the origin was. And a lot of groups like the Hezbollah can use these channels to transfer money from one part of the world to the other. And governments try to stop it. They come up with a plan, and it's like hitting
it's almost impossible.
It is. I mean, it works for a little while, but then suddenly they'll find another way. Another way. It's like hitting a pillow with your fist.
Yeah.
You hit the pillow, and the fist goes into it, and it doesn't affect. But then, 2 minutes later, it's back to the way it was.
Yeah, that's great. Charles, do you have other projects on the way?
I do. A new book's coming out, a nonfiction book this time, called The 21st Century Economy.
All right.
Obviously, with the global financial meltdown, it's the time to be writing a book on the 21st century economy. The idea of the new book is to talk about new things, how this economy is completely different from the ones before. And it seems to have already, it hasn't come out yet, but already the signs are that the pre-sales are huge. So it's fun actually to go from fiction to nonfiction. And then the idea is then to go back to fiction again, because you learn things, you take things from real life, the real world, and then do what I did in Trust, which is to do a what if and say, well, now wouldn't this be fun to see what would happen if, say, like, we've all heard about this New York fund manager who basically cheated people out of $50 billion in money. Wouldn't that be a great story? What if go into his story and see, how somebody could do that for 15 years, basically cheat money, and no one knew about it. It's like, stories are just waiting in the real world to be sort of turned into fiction.
Okay. Now let's talk about other things. What do you like most in current cinema?
Cinema. I love character-driven movies. I love movies that are not necessarily, action, buildings being blown up, cars crashing through windows, which unfortunately a lot of current cinema is all about. I think part of that, the reason is if you compare cinema today to cinema of the 1930s or 1940s, when you had basically the audience were adults going and watching movies, you made movies for adults.
Yeah.
And today, especially with DVDs and the whole rest. The cinema itself, to actually go to the movies, it's basically teenagers who go. So most movies today that you would see in the cinema, unfortunately, I think are made for teenagers, which means that the characters they're caricatures. They're not really rich, deep characters. When a good movie does come along, though,
that's true.
It makes for wonderful cinema if you can have rich characters, and even like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie do action movies. But at the same time, they bring something into their characters, and it's lacking today.
And everything.
Yeah.
What's your opinion of the worldwide financial crisis? That's a good question.
Wow, that is a good question. As I described before, the new book I wrote, the whole sort of concept of it is what I called fusion economics, and the idea that you have before you had each economy basically acted on its own. Brazil was Brazil, U.S. was U.S., France was France, and Japan was Japan. And now what we've seen in this global meltdown, the world economy is becoming fused, a fusion, like fusion cuisine, or a fusion reactor, where you have molecules joining together and then setting off a whole amount of new energy. So this idea of fusion economics is something that I've written about in the book, The 21st Century Economy. But I think it applies to the whole situation today. If you just look at a list of which markets went down over the last year during the financial crisis. Every one of them did. There wasn't one that did something different from the others. That Brazil, for example, even though the economic fundamentals were in place, because people were losing money in the United States and in London, they pulled their money out of Brazil, bought dollars to sort of fill in the holes of their investments in the United States, the money that they had lost. They tried to replace that. Well, what happened was that then Brazil's market crashed. The real went down for no reason other than the fact that Brazil was just part of this fusion economy. And you've seen that all over the world, Japan, the Far East, Europe.
Everywhere.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
And so for me, and that's new, in the 20th century, there were minor connections, but it was basically each country could decide what it would do a central bank could decide what it would need to do on its own. You can't do that anymore. Everything's connected.
Yes. Now I want to make a personal question for you. What do you think about the new president?
The new president has his work cut out for him. Yeah. What I found interesting is obviously he shows signs of being completely different from the previous one.
Yes.
But unfortunately, the rest of the world is still seeing the United States as the result of the previous president. So they're giving, it would be sort of like, going to General Motors and expecting to have a new president there. General Motors completely changed the way they make cars.
Yeah.
You can't really do that. You would have to completely change the whole structure. And I think that's something that the new president is going to have to try to do. Even if he succeeds, it will take many years. So I'm not expecting any big changes in the short term. I'm really not, no.
Really? I think that for the first time, the whole world is watching to America in a different way.
In a different way.
Hope, I think it's amazing the way that everything is happening now, because for the first time I seen one president having a lot of passion of the other people outside of America.
It's true.
And it's amazing.
It's true. They did a survey before the election, which countries would vote for Obama and which ones would vote for McCain. And I think there were 3 out of 160 that would have voted for McCain. One of them was Iraq. So
yes, Jesus Christ, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And for the very first time, I think it is a record of number of people who went to vote.
Yeah, it was, but apparently it wasn't that much more.
Oh, really?
It was 5% more than normal.
Okay.
Which was a part of
record.
It is a record, but it's part of this idea that I have. I think there's right now a lot of expectations that things are going to be quite different.